Knox Valenti didn't come to an illegal fight ring in a Brooklyn warehouse every Saturday night to win. Winning meant nothing when no one could touch you. He came to bleed, to crack, to feel something other than the thing he'd been carrying for 20 years, that no amount of money or power could fix. He was 36, 6'2", 210 of scar tissue and cold precision, the kind of man who owned half the real estate in Lower Manhattan and could end a life with a phone call, but couldn't sleep without the lights on. Tonight he'd just dropped a 260-pound ex-MMA fighter in 90 seconds flat, and 200 people had gone silent. Not the impressed kind of silent, the afraid kind, because they weren't watching a fight anymore, they were watching something they didn't have a name for. Knox stood in the center of the ring, blood on his hands that wasn't his, scanning the room for the next hit, the next body, the next dose of pain, and that's when he saw her. Corner of the room, mop in hand, faded gray t-shirt, torn jeans, hair pulled back with a rubber band that cost less than the dust on his shoes. The cleaning lady. She wasn't afraid. She wasn't impressed. She was studying the way he fought, the way a surgeon studies a botched procedure. And then she did something no one had done to Knox Valenti in 20 years. She shook her head. Small. Almost unconscious, like watching someone get a simple thing fundamentally wrong. He stepped off the ring, walked straight to her, and kicked her bucket over. Dirty water soaked her shoes, the only pair she owned. The room went dead. She looked at the water, looked at her ruined shoes, then looked up at him with brown eyes that carried absolutely zero fear. "Walk away," she said. "I'm working." He offered $50,000 to step in the ring with him for 3 minutes. She countered with 100,004 words that would change his life. "And I won't need 3. 60 seconds later, Knox Valenti was on one knee, gasping, drenched in sweat, and she hadn't touched him once. She'd moved around every strike like water past stone, until he'd beaten himself into exhaustion while she stood there without a single hair out of place. She looked down at him and said something that wasn't for the crowd. It was for him. "I see a man trying to hit until he can't feel anything anymore, and I'm the only person in this room who sees it." Then she stepped off the ring, picked up her mop, and went back to work. If you want to know who she is, and why she's the only one who can break Knox Valenti, hit like, share this, and subscribe so you don't miss what's next. Now let's go back to that warehouse in Brooklyn, and the night everything changed. Knox Valenti remained on his knees on the floor for 3 seconds after she stepped down. And in those 3 seconds, not a single person among the 200 people dared to move. Tate Moran was the first to break the frozen stillness. He rushed through the crowd with his right hand already resting on the gun tucked behind his back, his eyes sweeping from Knox to the girl who was calmly picking up the mop, as though nothing had just happened. Tate hadn't even had time to draw his gun before Knox lifted a hand to stop him, without looking at Tate, his eyes still fixed on the thin back of the girl walking toward the corner of the room. "Who are you?" Knox asked, his voice rougher than he wanted it to be. And that question rang through the silent fighting floor like a stone dropping into a deep well. She didn't turn around. She was wringing the mop into the bucket someone had set upright for her, calm as though the last 60 seconds had never happened. "The floor cleaner," she said, without looking up, without turning her head, her voice so flat that Knox couldn't tell whether it was defiance or nothing more than the simple truth. Then she walked out the back door. She didn't hurry. She didn't run. Her steps were steady, the steps of someone used to disappearing without anyone noticing. Except this time, the whole room was watching her, and she still didn't bother to look back even once. The iron door closed behind her with a rusty groan, and she vanished into the Brooklyn night as though she had never been there at all. Tate stepped close to Knox and lowered his voice. "Do you want someone to follow her?" Knox didn't answer. He rose slowly, his left knee still leaving its mark on the canvas of the fighting floor. And what was running through his mind right now wasn't anger, wasn't humiliation, wasn't the familiar hunger demanding that he find the next opponent and beat him until his hands went numb and his head became empty enough to survive one more week. What was running through his mind was a question. One single question he couldn't find an answer to, and Knox Valenti wasn't a man accustomed to not having an answer. 200 people began to move, whispers rising, bets changing hands in confusion because no one knew who should be paid. When the loser was the owner of the fighting ring, and the winner was the floor-cleaning girl who had just walked out the back door. Knox looked down at the floor. The bucket of water was still there, the dirty puddle spreading into an uneven shape across the concrete, and her wet footprints were still stamped on the floor, small, faint, slowly drying. He looked at his hands. The two hands that had once knocked down men, 40 kilos heavier than him, had once closed around throats, had once signed contracts worth millions of dollars, were trembling. Not from exhaustion. Knox knew his body well enough to tell the difference. This tremor came from somewhere else, from a place deeper than muscle, deeper than bone, from the place he had spent 20 years building walls around and believed nothing could ever reach. The floor-cleaning girl had just reached it without even lifting a hand. "Find her," Knox said to Tate without turning around. "Find me everything about her." 48 hours after that night, Knox Valenti had fought 2 more matches on the fighting floor, and won both without being able to remember his opponents' faces. The first was a former mercenary who outweighed him by 20 kilos. Knox took him down in 40 seconds and felt absolutely nothing at all. The second was a street boxer from the Bronx, whom someone had brought in to restore the fighting floor's pride. Knox ended it in less than a minute, and stepped off the floor with bruised hands and a hollow space in his chest that felt wider than it had before he climbed up. Every blow he threw in those 2 fights was aimed at the same thing, the same emptiness that 20 years of violence still hadn't been able to fill. But now there was something else wedged in the middle of it, the image of the girl standing in front of him without a single hair out of place, while he beat himself into exhaustion, and the sentence he heard again in his head every time he closed his eyes. Tate placed the file on Knox's desk on the afternoon of the second day, a thin stack of papers, because that girl's life didn't have much to record. Sloan Mercer, 26 years old, born in Portland, Oregon, no criminal record, no passport, no bank account that had held more than $300 at any point in the past 2 years. 3 jobs: janitor at the underground fighting floor on Saturday night shifts, dishwasher at an Italian restaurant in Williamsburg on evening shifts from Monday to Friday, and housekeeper at a cheap motel in Bed-Stuy during the day. Estimated total income under $2,000 a month. Paid in cash, no contract, no insurance. Not a single safety net between her and the sidewalk. She rented a studio in Bushwick, paying cash to the landlord without any paperwork at all. The kind of arrangement both sides pretended didn't exist until one side decided it truly didn't. The most recent electricity shutoff notice was 3 weeks ago. $38,000 in medical debt from a hospital in Brooklyn, with the patient listed as Patricia Mercer, her mother, who had died 2 years earlier of cancer. Knox read slowly, not because he didn't understand, but because every line in this file painted the picture of a person living by gritting her teeth and enduring one day at a time. And Knox realized this was the first time he had ever read someone's file without looking for a weakness to exploit. He was looking for something else. He was trying to understand who she was. On the last page, Tate had clipped a photograph. Old, its corners curled, its colors faded in the way of photos printed at home in the early 2000s. A girl about 8 years old stood on the wooden porch of a small house, beside a middle-aged man with a solid build and broad shoulders. Both of them were in fighting stances, hands raised, feet planted, shoulder-width apart, and both of them were smiling. The little girl's smile was so wide it showed the gap where a baby tooth had just fallen out. The man's smile was the kind of smile only fathers have when they see their daughter doing something that makes them both proud and quietly heartbroken, because they know the world won't be gentle with that child. The father's name listed on the old birth certificate Tate had dug up was James Mercer. Knox read the name out loud without realizing he was doing it until Warren Briggs, sitting in the armchair in the corner of the room as he had every afternoon for the past 15 years, looked up, and the face of the 64-year-old man, the man who had sat still through every war, every purge, every long night of the Valenti organization, without a change in expression, shifted for the first time with something behind his eyes. "I know that name," Warren said, his voice lower than usual, and Knox realized he wasn't only remembering, he was seeing something again. Warren told the story, brief in the way he always told everything. James Mercer had once been the finest close combat trainer the East Coast underworld had ever known. Not the kind of good people praised politely, but the kind of good that even men who had killed with their bare hands had to admit was on another level. He trained fighters for many organizations, including some that even Knox didn't want to provoke. Then, about 10 years ago, James Mercer was reported dead in a suspicious accident, though his body was never recovered. The official story said it was just a mishap, but rumors in the underworld were cheaper than bullets and only half as trustworthy. Knox said nothing. He looked at the photograph of the 8-year-old girl on the porch in Portland, in her fighting stance, smiling with one tooth missing. Then he pulled out his phone and opened the video Tate had recorded the night before. The clip of the janitor girl standing on the fighting floor during the longest 60 seconds of his life. He scrubbed through the footage Tate had recorded of their own fight, freezing the frame at the exact moment she shifted left to avoid his right cross. The same stance, the same placement of the feet, the same angle of the shoulders. The young girl on that faded porch, and the woman who had just brought him to his knees, used the exact same shadow of a movement, passed from father to daughter. Knox chose the Italian restaurant in Williamsburg from the list of 3 work addresses Tate had provided. Because it was the evening shift, there were fewer people, and the back door opened into an alley empty enough for a conversation without 200 pairs of eyes watching. He parked the Bentley 10 meters from the back door, turned off the engine, and sat there waiting. 10:45 at night. The fluorescent light from the restaurant kitchen spilled into the alley in a pale yellow strip. The smell of dish soap and old grease mixing with the November air of Brooklyn. Knox Valenti, the man who owned half the real estate in Lower Manhattan, sat in a $400,000 car, waiting for a girl to finish her dishwashing shift, and he didn't know what he was going to say. This was the first time he didn't have a script. 11 o'clock. The back door opened with the clatter of rusty hinges. Sloane stepped out in the grease-stained apron she hadn't had time to remove, her hair still tied high with the familiar elastic band, and the shoes she was wearing were a different pair, old sneakers with the glue peeling at the toes, because the only pair she had before had been ruined by him with a bucket of dirty water. She saw the Bentley immediately. A car like that sat in this alley like a spelling mistake in a sentence. She saw Knox get out of the car, and she stopped, but not because she was afraid. She stopped because she was tired. Not tired because of him, tired because of everything. Tired in the way of someone who had stood washing dishes for 6 straight hours after cleaning 14 motel rooms since morning, and before that, hadn't slept properly on any night that week, because the electricity was about to be cut off, and the rent was 3 months late. The kind of tired that had no room left for fear, because fear needed energy too. Knox pulled an envelope from the pocket of his suit jacket, thick, white, and held it out. $100,000. The money she had won on the fighting floor and hadn't taken. "It's yours," he said. "You won. This is your prize money." Sloane looked at the envelope, looked at him, then looked back at the envelope. "I don't take pity money," she said. "This isn't pity. You won. The money is yours. You came here at 11 o'clock at night and parked a $400,000 car in a trash alley to give money to a dishwasher," Sloane said, her voice not mocking, only stating the truth. "That isn't paying prize money. That's pity and pretty packaging." Knox lowered the envelope. He had expected her to refuse the money, but he hadn't expected the way she refused it. Precise, calm, and leaving him no opening to turn no into yes. He moved to the second offer, work for him, not as a janitor, but as a personal trainer, teaching close combat to his team, a salary 10 times higher than the combined income from her 3 current jobs. Her mother's $38,000 medical debt would be wiped clean in the first week. A private room, safety, no strings attached. Knox laid it out neatly, clearly, the way he laid out every deal. And he saw something move through her eyes when he mentioned the medical debt. Not greed. Pain, brief but real, like a crack across the surface of the reinforced glass she had built around herself. Then the crack sealed shut. "My father used to work for people like you," Sloane said, and for the first time, her voice carried something heavier than flatness. Not anger, not contempt, but memory. He was the best at a profession no one should be good at, and it killed him. Knox stood still. That sentence closed every door his offer had just opened. And he knew that any logical argument he gave next would be meaningless, because she wasn't making this decision with logic. She was making it with pain, and Knox Valenti understood pain deeply enough to know that no amount of money could buy a way through it. And maybe because he understood that, he said the next thing. Not from a script, not from the instinct for negotiation he had sharpened over 20 years, but from some place even he didn't know he still had. "I don't know how to ask properly," he said. "I've never had to learn. But I'm asking." Sloane looked at him. For a long time, and in that gaze, Knox had the feeling she was weighing not the offer, but the man himself, peeling back each layer he wore to see whether anything real existed underneath. Then she turned away. "Good night, Mr. Valenti," she said over her shoulder, and walked down the alley toward the streetlight at the end, without looking back, without hesitating, with the steady steps of someone used to leaving everything behind, because there had never been anything worth turning back for. Knox stood in the alley beside the Bentley, the $100,000 envelope in his hand, the smell of restaurant grease in the air, and for the first time in his adult life, he didn't know what to do. He had been rejected, and what made him stand there longer than he should have, longer than any boss should stand in a trash alley in Williamsburg at 11 o'clock at night, was that she hadn't rejected his money, hadn't rejected his power, hadn't rejected his empire. She had rejected him himself. And Knox Valenti wasn't angry. He was confused. That was a feeling whose name he had forgotten a very long time ago. 3 days after the night in the restaurant alley, Sloane got back to her studio in Bushwick at 6 o'clock in the evening, after her motel housekeeping shift, and found that the lock on the door had been changed. Her key no longer fit. 2 black trash bags holding all the clothes she owned and a shoebox containing her personal things had been placed on the sidewalk right in front of the steps, with no paperwork, no notice, no explanation at all. Because, when she rented in cash without a contract, the landlord didn't need to explain when he changed the lock either. That was the silent agreement both sides had understood from the beginning. Sloane had simply always thought she would have more time. It started raining at 6:30. Not hard rain, just November rain in Brooklyn. Cold, fine, persistent. The kind of rain that soaked into the bones before a person even realized they were wet. Sloane sat on the steps in front of the door with the changed lock, the 2 black trash bags on her left, the shoebox on her lap, and she didn't cry. The last time she had cried was at her mother's funeral 2 years earlier, standing alone in a Brooklyn cemetery in the middle of a March rain with a total of $38,000 in medical debt and not a single living relative left in the world, and she had decided that day that it would be the last time. Not because she was strong, because there wasn't enough of anything left inside her to cry out anymore. She looked down at her wrist, the old leather bracelet, darkened by sweat and time, its edges frayed, though the hand-stitching still held firm. Her father had worn it in every photograph she could remember. He had taken it off and given it to her on the last morning she ever saw him, when she was 16, and he had said a sentence she had repeated in her head every day for the past 10 years, but had never spoken aloud to anyone. She opened the shoebox. Inside were a few loose notebook pages in her father's handwriting, blue ink on yellowed paper, close combat technique notes, and short passages she didn't know whether to call a journal or a will. This was all that remained of James Mercer, apart from the leather bracelet and the daughter sitting in the rain on a Bushwick sidewalk. Sloane closed the shoebox, pushed it into one of the trash bags to keep it from getting wet, and began thinking about where she would sleep tonight. The subway station wasn't safe for a woman alone at midnight. The cheapest lodging house she knew still cost $40 a night, and she had less than $20 in her wallet. She could sit in the 24-hour laundromat on the corner until morning, but that was only a solution for one night, and she needed a solution for the rest of her life. That was when she remembered the white envelope. She had found it 3 days earlier, tucked into the bottom of her janitor's locker at the fighting floor, with no sender's name, only a piece of paper inside with a line of handwriting that trembled slightly in the way old people's hands did. But every stroke was clear. James Mercer's daughter shouldn't be sleeping on the street. Along with it was a phone number. She had shoved the envelope into her jacket pocket and hadn't thought about it again, because back then she still had a roof, still had a lock that hadn't been changed, still had enough pride to believe she didn't need anyone. Now she sat under the November rain with all her belongings in 2 black trash bags, and pride couldn't keep her warm. She pulled out the envelope. Read the line again. Someone in Knox Valenti's organization knew who her father was. Not only knew his name, but knew enough to write that line. Knew enough to care. Sloane dialed the number. Not because she trusted Knox, not because his offer in the restaurant alley 3 nights earlier had changed her mind, but because she was sitting in the rain with $20 in her wallet and not one other door left to knock on, and the only door still open was the one leading straight into the world that had killed her father. The phone rang twice. The person on the other end picked up. Not Knox. An old voice, low, calm. Warren Briggs. "I read your letter," Sloane said, her voice damp as rain but not shaking. "You knew my father." Silence for 2 seconds. Then Warren spoke, gently, in the way only people who had lost too much knew how to be gentle. "I'll send a car to pick you up. Don't go anywhere." The next morning, Sloane Mercer stood in the middle of Knox Valenti's penthouse, on the 42nd floor of a building on Central Park West, and the distance between the Bushwick sidewalk last night and the place where she was standing now couldn't be measured in kilometers, but in worlds. 4,000 square feet of floor-to-ceiling glass walls, November morning light pouring through the windows in long streaks across the dark oak floor, a floor she knew for certain cost more than everything she had ever owned in her life combined. She stood in the middle of the living room with 2 black trash bags of clothes at her feet, the shoebox tucked beneath her arm, her clothes neat but her eyes carrying the quiet exhaustion of a long, sleepless night spent weighing the choices ahead. She looked at the coffee machine on the kitchen counter, the Italian kind where the cost of a single espresso it made was probably equal to the rent of her old place for one day. Warren Briggs had picked her up the night before, taken her to a clean hotel room near headquarters, and this morning he had brought her here without explaining much beyond one sentence. He wants to talk. You don't have to agree to anything. Knox sat at the dining table, an espresso in front of him, black suit, black shirt, and the appearance of a man who hadn't slept any more than she had. He didn't stand up when she walked in, didn't offer his hand, didn't smile. He only looked at her with those blue-gray eyes she was beginning to understand weren't cold, but empty, the way a room is empty after everything inside has been cleared out a very long time ago. "Sit," he said. Sloane sat, not because he told her to, but because her legs had been moving non-stop since yesterday morning, and if she stood for 10 more minutes, her knees would make the decision for her. Knox laid down the rules, brief, clear, non-negotiable, the way a man used to giving orders laid down rules. She would train his team in close combat, 8 people, 6 days a week. She would have her own room in this building, on the 40th floor, 2 floors below him, with her own lock, and no one would be allowed in unless she invited them. She would be paid monthly, 10 times the combined income from her 3 old jobs. The medical debt would be handled within the first week. In exchange, she wouldn't ask about his business, wouldn't ask where the money came from, wouldn't ask why 8 people needed to learn how to fight, and why all of those people carried guns. Knox finished speaking, took a sip of espresso, and waited. Sloane looked at him, looked at the room, looked at Central Park 42 floors below, where the morning runners looked like tiny dots moving among rows of trees that had already shed their leaves. She knew that if she said yes now, she was stepping into the exact world her father had stepped into and never walked out of. She also knew that if she said no, she would be sitting on the sidewalk again tonight. It wasn't really a choice when only one door was open, but she could choose to open it her way. "One more condition," she said. Knox tilted his head slightly. He didn't refuse, hadn't agreed yet, only listened. "You learn too," Sloane said. "Personally, with me." 3 seconds of silence. "I don't need to learn how to fight," Knox said, and there was a flicker of something in his voice almost like a laugh, though it never reached his mouth. "You fight with anger," Sloane said, neither fast nor slow, her voice flat in the way a doctor reads test results. "It works because you're stronger than most people, but it'll fail the moment you meet someone calmer than you." She paused. "You've already met that person." The room went silent. November sunlight moved slowly across the wooden floor. Warren Briggs stood in the corner of the room, his face expressionless, but his eyes were on Sloane with something that, if Knox had turned around, he would have recognized as looking very much like hope. Knox set down the espresso cup. "Deal," he said. During the first week, Sloane realized that teaching close combat to the 8 men on Knox Valenti's team was entirely different from taking Knox down on the fighting floor. On the fighting floor, she had only needed to deal with one man and his anger. Here, she had to deal with 8 men, each of whom carried at least one gun, at least one sentence the police had never uncovered, and absolute contempt for anyone who didn't belong to their world. The training room was in the basement of a building Knox owned on West 30th Street, windowless, lit by cold white lights, with rubber-covered floors and a long row of heavy bags hanging on the wall, and from the stains on them, it wasn't only sweat. On the first session, Sloane stood in front of 8 men, and not one of them looked at her as if they were looking at a trainer. They looked at her as if she were something the boss had brought home for reasons they didn't want to think about, and that contempt didn't even need to be hidden, because in this world, women appeared in the training room of a Mafia organization for only one reason, and that reason had nothing to do with close combat. Sloane didn't explain, didn't introduce herself, didn't demand respect. She began teaching. Whoever wanted to learn could learn. Whoever didn't could stand there and watch. And after 3 sessions, the number of people actually paying attention rose from none to 3, because those 3 were smart enough to realize that the techniques she taught weren't in any book they had ever seen, and the way she moved didn't belong to someone who had learned in a gym, but to someone shaped from childhood by somebody who understood the line between training and survival. But the problem wasn't the 3 men who still refused to learn. The problem was Tate Moran. Tate didn't look down on Sloane the way the others did. He didn't sneer, didn't ignore her, didn't joke behind her back. Tate watched her with the intense focus of someone assessing a threat, because Tate saw what the other 7 didn't see. Knox was changing. Only slightly. Almost impossible to notice unless someone had been beside Knox every day for the past 9 years. Knox came to the training room on time instead of 10 minutes late in the manner of a boss. Knox let Sloane finish speaking before stepping in, instead of cutting her off. Knox drank 1 less glass each night instead of 3. Small changes that Tate felt, with the instinct of a man who had survived by reading his boss's mood every day. And each small change made the ground beneath Tate's feet shift a little more. On the 5th day, Tate couldn't stand it anymore. In the middle of training, in front of all 8 men and Knox standing in the corner observing, Tate walked straight up to Sloane and spoke, without lowering his voice, without hiding anything, because Tate Moran was the kind of man who confronted directly, not the kind who stabbed from behind. "You're turning him into something that'll get him killed," Tate said, and his voice didn't carry the hatred Sloane had prepared herself to receive, only real fear disguised as anger. "This world needs him dangerous. You take that away, and you take away the only thing keeping him and all of us alive." The training room went silent. 8 men stopped moving. Knox didn't move in the corner, his eyes shifting from Tate to Sloane, and Sloane understood that he wasn't interfering because he wanted to hear the answer too. Sloane looked at Tate. She saw the thing she had expected from the first day, but in a different form than she had predicted. Tate didn't hate her because she was a woman. Tate didn't hate her because his pride had been wounded. Tate was afraid of losing Knox, afraid of losing the version of Knox he knew how to serve, the version that was dangerous and predictable, and needed no one except Tate. She was taking away the thing Tate had built his entire existence around, and he was reacting the way anyone would react when the ground beneath their feet began to crack. "This world needs him alive," Sloane said, and she didn't speak louder than Tate, but she didn't speak softer either. "Being dangerous keeps people afraid of him, but it doesn't keep him alive. Those are 2 different things, and if you can't tell the difference, then you're not protecting him. You're just guarding a bomb waiting to explode." Tate didn't answer. He looked at Knox. Knox said nothing, and it was that silence that made Tate step back, because the old Knox would have cut in, would have given an order, would have closed the argument with 1 sentence. The new Knox stood still and let Sloane's answer hang in the air on its own. Tate left the training room without saying another word. That afternoon, Sloane went down to the basement to get water and met a 28-year-old woman sitting in front of a laptop screen in the small room at the end of the hallway, surrounded by files and ledgers. Lydia Hale, the organization's accountant, the only person in this building who watched Sloane walk past not with contempt or suspicion, but with curiosity, the kind of curiosity belonging to someone used to no one seeing her who had suddenly encountered someone else who was also not being seen. "You're the one who's made Tate want to punch a wall all week," Lydia said, without looking up from the screen. "I'm the trainer," Sloane replied. "I know who you are. The whole building knows." Lydia finally looked up, and in her eyes was the familiar weariness of someone who had been right too many times and had not been heard. "The organization is losing money," Lydia said, quietly, quickly, as if she had held that sentence in for too long and only needed one person willing to listen for it to spill out. 2,400,000 in the past 18 months, flowing through companies whose real owners I can't identify. I've reported it 3 times. No one listens to a female accountant talking about money in an organization full of men. Sloane looked at Lydia, looked at the pile of ledgers, looked at the door of the small room at the end of the hallway where probably no one ever entered, except Lydia. "I'm listening," Sloane said. The first private training session between Knox and Sloane took place at 10 o'clock at night, after the 8 men had left the training room and the building was almost empty, with only Tate upstairs guarding the door out of habit, and Warren having gone home long before. Knox walked into the training room already changed, black training pants, his hands wrapped, and he didn't say a single word as he took his place opposite Sloane on the rubber floor. She looked at him and saw immediately that the man standing in front of her now Wasn't the Knox she had sat across from at the table the previous morning when they signed the agreement. That man, at least, had still been trying to control himself. This man had left control outside the door. There was something in his eyes that Sloane recognized at once, because she had grown up beside it, had seen it in her father's eyes every time he came back from trips he never explained. Not anger. Anger had a target. The thing in Knox's eyes had no target. It only had a direction, and that direction was outward, through his fists, into whatever stood in front of him. Knox attacked. No warm-up, no testing, no polite nod people who trained in close combat usually gave each other before beginning. He attacked the way he fought on the fighting floor, his whole body thrown into every strike, his shoulder rotating to its full range, his fist aiming at the empty air where she had been standing 1/10 of a second earlier. Sloane dodged. But unlike the night on the fighting floor in front of 200 people, she didn't dodge in silence. She observed. With every strike Knox threw, she read not the path of his fist, but the thing controlling that fist. The first strike, a right cross, shoulder over-rotated, more force than necessary, the strike of a man who wanted to break something, not hit someone. The second strike, a left hook, elbow high, right ribs completely exposed. The strike of a man who didn't care whether he got hit back. The third, the fourth, the fifth. Each strike stronger than the one before it, but less accurate. Because Knox wasn't aiming at her. He was aiming at something else, and she just happened to be standing in the middle. Sloane had seen this before, on the fighting floor. But back then she had let him exhaust himself, because the purpose had been to prove something. Now the purpose was different. Now she needed him to understand. 5 minutes, Sloane counted in her head. 5 minutes of Knox attacking without stopping, sweat beginning to run, his breathing beginning to grow heavy. And she dodged every strike without countering, without pushing back, without touching him, moving around him with the instinct her father had carved into her body from before she even knew how to read. Then she stopped. Not stopped dodging, stopped completely. She stood still, in the middle of the training room, facing him. And Knox, his hand already raised for the next strike, had to stop himself because she was standing within hitting range and wasn't moving. And though Knox Valenti was many terrible things, he didn't hit someone who stood still and undefended. He stopped, his fist still raised, his chest rising and falling. His blue-gray eyes looked at her with the confusion of a man who had just been disarmed without understanding how. "You're not hitting me," Sloane said, her voice not breathless, not high, not low, flat as water after someone had thrown a stone into it, but she refused to ripple. "For the past 5 minutes, you haven't thrown a single strike aimed at me. You're hitting something else. I just happened to be standing in the middle." Knox didn't lower his hand. His jaw clenched. She saw the muscle in his jaw roll under his skin, and knew she was walking along a line where one wrong step could make him either close forever or open for the first time. "Until you stop hitting that thing," Sloane said, "I can't teach you anything. Because you're not here. You're somewhere else, somewhere much older than this room, and you're using your fists to try to get out. But it's not working because fists aren't an exit." Silence. Knox lowered his hand, slowly, not because he was exhausted, but because what she had just said had touched the exact place that 20 years of violence had built walls around, and for the first time, someone had not only dodged his punches, but said out loud what those punches were trying to hide. Not strength, not cruelty, not rage. Pain, just pain. And it had been there since he was 16 years old. Knox looked at her for 3 more seconds, then he left. No words, no slamming the door. He simply walked out of the training room with the steps of a man whose most hidden part had just been seen by someone, and who didn't yet know what to do with that. The door closed behind him, softly, and Sloane stood alone in the empty training room, under the cold white lights, the rubber floor still marked with his footprints, his sweat still in the air, and the silence so loud she could hear the steady hum of the ventilation system overhead. She looked down at her wrist, her father's old leather bracelet. She placed her finger on the frayed stitching and whispered, so softly that only the empty room could hear it. "Dad, what am I doing?" Knox returned to the training room the next night without saying anything about the night before, and Sloane didn't mention it either, because both of them understood that some things needed time to settle on their own before they could be looked at again. But something had changed. Sloane recognized it from the very first second. Knox took his position, because for the first time since she had met him, Knox didn't attack first. He stood there, hands raised, and waited for her to tell him what to do. It was a moment so small that anyone else would have missed it. But Sloane was James Mercer's daughter, and she had been taught that the moment a person stopped attacking first and began to listen was the moment everything truly began. The second week changed everything. Knox started learning for real, not in the careless way someone learned just to keep an agreement, but in the way of a man who had realized he didn't know as much as he thought and was trying to fill that emptiness with focus instead of fists. She taught him how to read an opponent's center of gravity through the movement of the hips instead of watching the eyes, because eyes knew how to lie, but hips didn't. She taught him how to use an opponent's force instead of fighting against it, how to turn an enemy's strongest attack into a weapon against that very enemy, simply by changing the angle of contact by 2 centimeters. And every time she corrected his posture, everything became more complicated. Her hand rested on his shoulder to adjust the angle of his rotation, and she felt his shoulder muscles tighten beneath her touch, not a fighting reflex, but the reflex of someone who wasn't used to being touched without pain. Her fingers closed around his wrist to adjust his guard, and he looked down at her hand on his wrist for 1 second longer than necessary, long enough for both of them to know it was no longer only a correction of form. She pulled his hips to the left to teach him how to shift his weight, and the space between their bodies narrowed to only a few centimeters, close enough for her to hear his breathing change, and she pulled her hand back faster than she needed to. Day after day, session after session, both of them realized that whatever was shifting between them wasn't written into any agreement Knox had laid out at the breakfast table that morning. Sloane kept more distance as she moved around him, stepped back farther after every correction, professional to the point of almost being cold, and that deliberate coldness spoke louder than any words because people didn't need to keep distance from something that didn't pull them closer. On the 12th night, the session ended later than usual. Knox sat on the rubber floor with his back against the wall, beginning to unwrap the bandages from his hands. Sloane was putting away the training gloves in the corner of the room when she turned back and saw it. Knox's left wrist, the bandage just removed, revealing old scars running across it. Not one scar, many scars, parallel, even, long-healed but still lighter than the surrounding skin, permanent. Sloane knew immediately they weren't fighting scars. Fighting scars were messy, uneven, never straight like that, never so regular. These scars had intention. Knox saw her looking, and for the first time, he didn't pull his sleeve down, didn't turn his wrist away, didn't cover it with any natural gesture. He had surely performed thousands of times in front of other people over the past 20 years. He let her look. The silence stretched. Not an uncomfortable silence, but the silence of 2 people standing before a door they both knew would not close again once opened. "My sister," Knox said, his voice low, his eyes on the scars across his own wrist, as though he were looking at the map of a place he didn't want to return to but had never truly left. "Colette, 14 years old. Shot dead in Newark right in front of me. I was 16. He said nothing more. Didn't explain who fired the shot, why, or what happened afterward. Only 4 sentences. But those 4 sentences held the 20 years Knox Valenti had tried and failed to bury with violence, money, power, and underground fights every Saturday. Sloane walked over to him. She sat down on the floor beside him, her back against the same wall, keeping enough distance not to touch him, but close enough for him to know she was there. "My father," she said, and her voice carried something she rarely allowed to show, not pain, but the familiarity of someone who knew exactly what the hole Knox was sitting in looked like, because she had been sitting in a hole just like it for 10 years. "Killed when I was 16. They said it was an accident. I never believed them." Knox turned to look at her. For the first time since they had met on the fighting floor, he looked at her not with curiosity, or challenge or confusion, but with recognition, the look of someone who had just discovered that another person spoke the same language he had thought only he spoke. 2 16-year-old children, who had lost everything, now sitting beside each other on the rubber floor of a basement training room in a Manhattan building near midnight, 20 centimeters apart, and 20 years of pain between them, pain neither of them had ever told anyone about. "Does it get lighter?" Knox asked very softly, as though the question was so fragile that saying it any louder would break it. "After 10 years?" Sloane was silent for a moment, not because she was thinking of the answer. She knew the answer. She was only choosing how to say it correctly. "No," she said. "It doesn't get lighter. but I found a way to carry it without falling. How? Sloane looked at the scars on his wrist, then at the leather bracelet on her own wrist. 2 wrists, 2 ways of carrying the same kind of pain. Stop punishing yourself for surviving, she said. Knox didn't answer, but he didn't stand up and leave the way he had the night before either. He stayed there, silent, beside her, and for the first time in 20 years, Knox Valenti let someone sit close enough to see the worst part of him without trying to turn it into something else. The next day, Lydia Hale knocked on Sloane's door at 7 o'clock in the morning with a stack of printed papers tucked under her arm and the face of someone who hadn't slept all night because what she had found wouldn't let her sleep. Sloane opened the door, looked at Lydia, looked at the papers, and knew at once that the brief conversation in the basement hallway last week had opened something that couldn't be closed again. Lydia stepped inside, spread the papers across the table, and began speaking in the fast, precise voice of someone who had arranged everything in her mind for a long time and only needed someone willing to listen for it to pour out in the right order. $2,400,000. Gone over the past 18 months, through 5 shell companies registered in Delaware, the kind of one-page company with no office, no employees, only a name and a bank account number. The money flowed from the Valenti organization's logistics payments into those companies, then disappeared through 3 more layers of transfers before evaporating completely. Lydia had spent 6 months tracing the trail, each layer more complicated than the one before it, and every time she reported it, what she received in return was the polite silence of men who didn't believe a 28-year-old female accountant could see something they couldn't see. But over the past week, Lydia had found the real name behind the 3rd shell company, the only name that repeated across all 5 companies if one knew where to look, and that name was Rourke Cassidy. Sloane was sitting on the edge of the bed listening to Lydia, her hand unconsciously turning the leather bracelet around her wrist, and when Lydia said the name Rourke Cassidy, her hand stopped. Not slowly. It stopped as if something had blocked it. Her entire body froze in a way Lydia had never seen in Sloane, because over the past 2 weeks, Lydia had watched Sloane face 8 armed criminals, face Tate Moran in the middle of the training room, face Knox Valenti on the fighting floor, and not once had this girl looked surprised. But now her face had gone white. "You know that name?" Lydia asked. Sloane didn't answer right away. She stood, walked over to the 2 black trash bags of belongings she still hadn't fully unpacked since the day she moved in, opened the shoebox, and took out several loose notebook pages, yellowed paper covered in her father's blue ink handwriting. She turned to the 3rd page and placed it on the table beside Lydia's file. In the middle of the page, among technical notes and addresses Sloane had never fully understood, there was one name underlined 3 times in red ink: Rourke Cassidy. Red ink, against yellowed paper, the underlines so heavy the ink had bled through to the back. Her father wasn't a man who wrote in red ink. He used blue ink for everything. Red ink was what he used when he wanted to remind himself not to forget, and he had underlined that name not once, but 3 times, as if he were afraid even he might overlook it. Sloane looked at Lydia. "My father knew this name 10 years ago, before he died." 20 minutes later, Sloane sat in Warren Briggs's office with Lydia's papers and her father's notebook page on the desk. Warren read the financial file first, slowly, carefully, his face expressionless in the way 64 years of experience had taught him to keep it. Then he looked at the notebook page, looked at the name underlined in red ink, and for the first time since Sloane had met him, perhaps for the first time in a very long time before that, Warren Briggs lost his composure. Not loudly. His hand, the hand that had stayed steady through every Valenti family war for 30 years, trembled. He set the paper down on the desk because he didn't want Sloane to see, but she had already seen. "Rourke Cassidy," Warren said, his voice lower than usual, and carrying something Sloane recognized as fear. Not fear for himself, but fear because of what he had just seen, and what it meant. "Rourke has managed East Coast logistics for the organization since before Knox took power. He was at Knox's father's funeral. He's been everywhere. He's been here from the beginning." Warren looked at Sloane. "If your father discovered Rourke was betraying the Valenti organization 10 years ago, and Rourke killed your father to close that loose end." He stopped. Not because he had run out of words, but because the next sentence would change everything, and he knew it. "Then Rourke was also the one who leaked the information that led to the Newark shooting," Sloane said for him. because she had already fitted that piece into place in her mind from the moment she saw the red-inked name on her father's notebook page, the shooting that killed Colette. Silence, the kind of silence so heavy Sloane could feel it pressing down on her shoulders. Colette Valenti, 14 years old, the girl whose death had turned Knox into a monster, and the man responsible for that death was still sitting inside the organization, still eating at the same table, still calling Knox by his name and shaking his hand every week for 20 years. "Knox doesn't know," Warren said, and it wasn't a question. "No," Sloane replied, "and if he knows now, he'll kill Rourke before midnight with his bare hands, and no one on earth will be able to stop him. He'll destroy everything, including himself." Warren looked at her for a long time, with the eyes of a man weighing not what had to be done, but who could be trusted to do it with him. "How do you want to handle this?" "We wait," Sloane said. "We build the evidence until there's no opening left. Rourke isn't the kind of man who falls because of one punch. He has to fall because there's nowhere left for him to stand." She looked at Warren. "Lydia and I will handle the money. You handle the people. Find out who Rourke is still connected to outside the organization. And you don't tell Knox. Not yet." Warren nodded, slowly, heavily, the nod of a man who had just placed his trust in the 26-year-old daughter of James Mercer. Not because she had earned it, but because watching her sit there planning to bring down the man who had killed her father with cold calm instead of blind rage, he saw James. And Warren Briggs had trusted James Mercer with his life. He would trust his daughter with the same thing. Catherine Ainsworth arrived in New York on Friday morning by private flight from Boston, and news of her appearance spread through the Valenti organization faster than the Gulf Stream touchdown at Teterboro. She was 58 years old, with platinum hair cut short to her chin, dressed in ash-gray Chanel, and she carried the particular stillness of a woman who had survived 30 years, in a world where women weren't invited to sit at the table by becoming the person who owned the table. Her husband, Arthur Ainsworth, had once controlled the entire East Coast port network from Boston to Savannah before lung cancer took his life 8 years earlier. 3 men had tried to seize control of that network after the funeral. All 3 were no longer in the business. Catherine never explained what had happened to them, and no one asked. The deal she brought was worth $200 million, merging the Ainsworth port network with Valenti's logistics system, turning both organizations from 2 regional powers into an empire that controlled the entire shipping chain of the American East Coast. This was the kind of deal that happened once in a generation, and Catherine knew it, Knox knew it, and everyone in the Valenti organization knew it. Catherine met Knox at the penthouse at 10 o'clock in the morning. Warren stood in the corner of the room. Tate stood outside the door. Sloane wasn't present because no one had invited her, and she didn't need an invitation to know what was happening, because Lydia had fully briefed her before Catherine even had time to sit down. Catherine didn't drink the coffee Knox offered, didn't shake hands, didn't make small talk. She looked at Knox with pale gray eyes that 30 years of experience had sharpened into measuring instruments, and said exactly one sentence. "I want to see your organization operate for 48 hours. No performance." Knox nodded. No objection, no negotiation, because he understood that Catherine Ainsworth wasn't setting a condition. She was giving him a chance to prove himself, and the difference between those 2 things would decide whether he deserved to sit at the same table with her. The 48 hours would begin on Saturday morning. Catherine would observe everything, from how the team operated to how Knox made decisions under pressure, and after those 48 hours, she would either sign or she would fly back to Boston, and this door would close forever. But the news about Catherine didn't spread only inside the Valenti organization. 23 blocks away, in an apartment in Murray Hill that no one in the organization knew he rented, Rourke Cassidy sat in front of his phone and did the calculation he had done many times over the past 20 years, the calculation of survival. If Catherine signed the deal, Knox would become too strong, too large, too protected for anyone to topple. For 20 years, Rourke had been hollowing out the organization from the inside, slowly, patiently. The $2,400,000 from the most recent 18 months was only the part visible above the surface, and he knew that once Knox added the Ainsworth port network, every number would be reviewed again, every opening would be examined, and the trail he had hidden so carefully would begin to show beneath the light of $200 million flowing into the system. Rourke had to act before Catherine signed. He picked up the phone and called a number in Philadelphia, a number he had kept for 5 years for exactly this kind of situation. The rival family across the state line, the ones who had watched Knox Valenti grow stronger for a decade with envy disguised as patience. Rourke sold them something money couldn't buy anywhere else: the internal Valenti shipping route information, accurate down to the hour, the location, and the number of men. Delivery on Sunday night. Red Hook Warehouse, Brooklyn. 6 of Knox's men would be present. No extra protection, because Knox didn't know someone was selling him out. Philadelphia received the information, and Catherine Ainsworth's 48 hours began counting down at the same time as the 48 hours of the trap Rourke Cassidy had just set. 2 clocks were running side by side, and no one in the penthouse on Central Park West knew the second one was ticking. Sunday night, 11 o'clock. Red Hook Warehouse, Brooklyn. Sloane shouldn't have been there. Under the original agreement, she didn't take part in the business, didn't ask where the money came from, didn't get involved in anything outside the training room. But that afternoon, when she heard Tate discussing the night delivery with Knox and saw the list of 6 men being sent, with not one of them experienced enough to read a situation before the situation read them, she went to Knox and said one sentence: "You're sending men into a place you don't control. Let me go on the rear route." Knox refused for 3 seconds before looking into her eyes and seeing something he had begun learning how to recognize over the past 2 weeks. Not recklessness, but real concern for the men she had spent 2 weeks teaching how to fight. Men who were now walking into a place she wasn't sure they would walk back out of. Knox let her go. Sloane sat in the second car with Knox and Tate, 200 meters from the warehouse, listening to the radio communication, while Knox's 6 men entered the warehouse to receive the shipment, according to the normal schedule. Everything was normal for the first 90 seconds. Then it wasn't normal anymore. The first gunshot rang out at 11:14 and didn't stop. The radio exploded with shouting, curses, metal striking concrete, and through all that chaos, Sloane heard enough to piece the picture together. An ambush, at least 8 men from the rival side, already positioned inside the warehouse before Knox's team arrived, which meant someone had sold the exact time and location, which meant this wasn't an accident. 4 of Knox's 6 men managed to get out through the main door in the first 2 minutes. 1 wounded in the shoulder but still able to walk on his own. The remaining 2 were trapped deep inside, behind a row of containers, their radios still working, but their voices made it clear that the path to the main door had been blocked. Sloane didn't wait for anyone's permission. She opened the car door and ran toward the warehouse before Knox could react. Not toward the main entrance where bullets were still flying, but around the side of the warehouse, where she had seen on the warehouse map Lydia showed her 2 days earlier that there was a side door used by loading workers. She got inside through that side door and found Knox's 2 men lying behind the last row of containers, one trying to stop the other's bleeding, both staring at her as she stepped out of the darkness, as if they were seeing something they couldn't believe was real. Sloane didn't explain. She told them to stay down, and she listened. Listened to the enemy's footsteps. Listened to the way they moved between the containers. Listened to how sound bounced back from the concrete walls to locate their exact positions, a technique her father had called reading space with your ears, and had taught her on the porch in Portland by blindfolding her and throwing tennis balls from different directions until she could catch them without seeing. Outside, Knox sat in the car listening to the radio, and for the first time in his life, he experienced something he had no word for, because it wasn't fear in the way he understood fear. Not fear for himself, not fear of losing money or losing power, but fear of losing one specific person. And the difference between those 2 kinds of fear was as wide as an ocean. Knox grabbed his gun, opened the car door, and Tate stopped him. "You go in there, you die," Tate said, his face pale, his shoulder still aching from training last week. Knox looked at Tate with eyes Tate had never seen in 9 years of service. The eyes of a man being torn in half between the instinct to rush in and something else. Something Sloane had been building inside him over the past 2 weeks without him realizing it until this very moment, the ability to stop. Knox listened to the radio, listened to Sloane's voice inside, low, calm, speaking to the 2 trapped men, with the voice of someone in complete control of the situation. And he made the hardest decision of his life, not because it was complicated, but because it required him to do the one thing Knox Valenti had never done: trust someone enough not to charge in. Knox ordered the outside team to hold the perimeter, concentrate fire on the main entrance to pull the enemy's attention away from the side of the warehouse, and keep the side door clear. Inside, Sloane heard the gunfire at the main entrance intensify, and knew Knox was creating an escape route for her. She led the 2 men between the containers, step by step, each footfall placed in rhythm with the gunfire so their steps wouldn't be heard, until all three of them reached the side door and the streetlight from outside slipped in. 4 minutes. From the moment Sloane went in to the moment the three of them came out. 4 minutes in which Knox stood outside the car, gun in hand, and didn't rush in. The longest 4 minutes in the life of a man whose instinct for 20 years had been to destroy anything standing in his way. Sloane stepped out through the side door, concrete dust in her hair, the smell of gunpowder on her shirt, Knox's 2 men behind her, one bleeding but walking on his own. Knox stood there, his gun still in his hand, and when she came close enough for him to see her face clearly under the streetlight, he drew in a long breath he hadn't known he had been holding for the past 4 minutes. "I wanted to rush in," he said, his voice rough. Sloane looked at him, dust on her face, breathing hard but standing steady, brown eyes meeting blue-gray ones in the Brooklyn night that smelled of gunpowder. "I know," she said. "Thank you for not doing it." They pulled back, all of them. No chasing the enemy, no going back for the shipment, no revenge. Knox gave the order to return safely, and no one argued, because for the first time, they had seen their boss make a decision, not from anger, but from something clearer. In the car on the way back to Manhattan, there was silence. Tate drove. Knox sat in the back seat beside Sloane. Streetlights passed over the car windows in mute streaks across both their faces. As the car crossed the Brooklyn Bridge, Knox reached out and took Sloane's hand. He said nothing, didn't look at her, just held on, with a hand still stained with gunpowder dust. The hand that had clenched into a fist for 20 years, and was now holding something else. Sloane didn't pull away. She didn't squeeze back, not yet, but she didn't pull away. And in the darkness of the back seat of a car crossing the Brooklyn Bridge near midnight, that was already enough. The next morning, Sloane didn't wait for Knox to find the answer on his own to the question she knew had been eating through him since the night before. Who had sold the delivery information to Philadelphia? She called Lydia and Warren to the penthouse at 8 o'clock in the morning, before Knox even had time to come out of his room, and when he stepped into the living room with coffee in his hand and the face of a man who hadn't slept for even 1 second, he saw 3 people sitting around the dining table with a file 2 centimeters thick placed in the center. Knox looked at Sloane, looked at Warren, looked at Lydia, whose name he barely remembered even though she had been the accountant for his organization for nearly 3 years, looked at the file. "Sit down," Sloane said, and this was the first time she spoke to Knox in a voice that wasn't the voice of a trainer, wasn't the voice of a tenant, wasn't the voice of the floor-cleaning girl, but the voice of someone about to hand him something that would destroy everything he thought he knew about the past 20 years. Knox sat. Sloane pushed the file toward him and said nothing more, because what lay inside it needed no introduction. Knox opened the first page. Lydia's financial report. $2,400,000 gone through 5 shell companies in Delaware over 18 months. The transfer trail passing through 3 intermediary layers, and the name Rourke Cassidy appearing at every turn. Knox read slowly, page by page. His face held no expression, the kind of expressionlessness Sloane had learned how to read over the past 2 weeks. Not calm, but control. And the distance between those two things was the distance between a bomb stored safely away and a bomb counting down. On page 12, Lydia had connected the money trail from Rourke to an account in Philadelphia. Knox's jaw hardened, but he kept reading. On page 15, Warren had traced the history of contact between Rourke and the rival family, not just this week but over 5 years, meaning Rourke hadn't betrayed them out of panic. It had been a long-term plan, patient, systematic. Knox's jaw clenched, but he still read. Then he reached page 18. The page Sloane had placed at the end, because she knew it would be the thing that broke every ounce of control Knox was holding on to. Several loose pages from James Mercer's notebook, blue ink handwriting, and the name Rourke Cassidy underlined 3 times in red ink. Attached to it was Warren's note, connecting the timeline. James Mercer had discovered Rourke's betrayal of the Valenti organization about 10 years earlier. James had been killed soon afterward, and the information Rourke sold outside the organization at that time had included the Valenti family's travel route, information the enemy had used to carry out the shooting in Newark, the shooting that killed Colette. Knox set the paper down, slowly, carefully, as if setting down something explosive. He stood, walked to the window, and stood there, looking out over Manhattan 42 floors below. 30 seconds of silence. Sloane counted every second, because she needed to know exactly how long it would take him before he turned back, and she needed to prepare for what would be on his face when he did. 30 seconds. Knox turned back, and what was on his face wasn't rage. Sloane knew how to handle. What was on his face was collapse, the kind of silent collapse that happens when the foundation a person has built his entire life upon suddenly turns to sand. For 20 years, Knox had believed Colette died because of random violence, because the underworld was a place where things like that happened, and no one was at fault except the world itself. For 20 years, he had punished himself on the fighting floor because he hadn't protected his sister, building everything. Power, violence, an empire, on the foundation of, I did everything I could. And now that foundation no longer existed, because the person who killed Colette wasn't some random world. It was Rourke Cassidy, the man who had come to Colette's funeral. He came to her funeral, Knox said, his voice so flat it was frightening, the flatness of the sea before a tsunami. He put flowers on her coffin. White flowers. I remember because Colette hated white flowers. She only liked yellow ones. And I thought he didn't know. Not that he didn't need to know because he was the one who put her in there. Silence. Warren looked down at the table. Lydia looked at her own hands. No one in the room dared to look directly into Knox's eyes right then, because whatever was moving behind those blue-gray eyes could burn the whole room down. I want him dead, Knox said. Tonight. Sloane stood up, stepped closer to him. Not the closeness of someone offering comfort, but the closeness of someone blocking the road. No, she said. Knox turned to her, and in that second, Sloane saw exactly what she feared most. The old Knox. Knox on the fighting floor. Knox beating Volkov, the monster she had spent the past 2 weeks beginning to find the man beneath, rising up and demanding blood. He killed my father too, Knox. That sentence stopped him more cleanly than any strike she had ever dodged. Knox looked at her. The wild thing in his eyes crashed against the stillness in hers. And for the first time he saw her, not through the lens of a trainer, not through the lens of the floor-cleaning girl, not through the lens of someone he was beginning to feel something for. He saw her as someone who had carried a blood debt against Rourke Cassidy longer than he had. James Mercer discovered Rourke's betrayal, Sloane said, her voice not shaking, not fast, not slow. The voice of someone who had lived for 10 years with this secret without knowing it, and now that she knew, she wouldn't let it slip away. Rourke killed my father to close the loose end. I've carried this blood debt longer than you, and I'm telling you, killing him tonight gives him the easiest death he could receive. Quick, clean, over. He doesn't deserve to have it end that quickly. She stopped. I want him to lose everything. Money, allies, standing, identity. I want him to watch everything he built with other people's blood fall apart piece by piece. And I want him to live long enough to feel every piece drop. Knox looked at her, and what he saw in her eyes wasn't weakness that needed protection, wasn't fragility that needed sheltering. He saw a blade that had sharpened itself in the dark for 10 years, patient, silent, waiting for the right moment. And the right moment was now. Together? He asked, very softly. And those 2 words carried more than their own meaning, because this was the first time Knox Valenti had asked someone to do something with him instead of giving an order. Together, Sloane said. It took them 2 days to build the trap, and Sloane designed it the way her father would have designed it. No violence, no guns, no blood, only information placed in exactly the right place, at exactly the right time, so the prey would walk in by itself. Lydia created a fake internal financial report showing that the Valenti organization had just discovered a system gap in the logistics division and needed Rourke Cassidy to come to the executive office at the Red Hook shipping terminal for an emergency meeting to reconcile the original ledgers, a closed-door review between only Rourke and Knox. It was the perfect bait because it struck 2 things at once: the fear of being exposed and the ego of a man who believed he was smarter than everyone else. Sloane chose this corporate executive office deliberately, forcing Rourke to sit in a room wrapped in glass, looking directly down at the massive cargo ships he had been secretly draining for years. Rourke walked into the warehouse at 10:10, 10 minutes late in the habit of a man who wanted to prove he hadn't been summoned by anyone. 52 years old, salt and pepper hair, gray suit. The confident stride of a man who had lived for 20 years on trust he didn't deserve to receive. He stepped through the iron door and saw Knox sitting at the table in the middle of the warehouse, industrial light pouring down from above, a file 2 centimeters thick spread across the tabletop. Warren stood to the left, Tate stood to the right, and behind Knox, standing in the half-dark, half-lit space, was Sloane. Rourke saw the file first. Then he saw Knox, face expressionless, blue-gray eyes flat as reinforced glass. Then he saw Sloane, and he stopped. Not a normal pause. He froze, because Rourke Cassidy had killed James Mercer 10 years earlier, and he knew exactly who those brown eyes belonged to, because they were the eyes he had last seen on the face of a middle-aged man in an alley in Portland before everything ended. And now those eyes were looking at him from the face of a 26-year-old woman, standing behind the Mafia boss he had been betraying for 2 decades. "The Mercer girl," Rourke said, and for the first time, his voice lost the calm he had worn like a coat of paint for 20 years. Sloane didn't answer. She didn't need to. She stood there and let her presence speak for her, because every second Rourke looked at her was another second. He understood that the past he thought he had buried had just dug itself up and was standing there breathing in front of him. Knox opened the file. No explanation. He only turned it toward Rourke so he could see the first page. The trail of $2,400,000, 5 Delaware companies, and the name Rourke Cassidy repeated on every page like a sentence. Then Knox flipped to the last page, the page where Warren had connected Rourke to the information leak that led to Newark, that led to Colette. Knox stood, stepped in front of Rourke, close enough for Rourke to smell coffee on Knox's breath, close enough to see the vein pulsing at Knox's temple, close enough to understand that the distance between him and death was now thinner than a sheet of paper. Knox's fist clenched. 20 years of rage, 20 years of fighting floors, 20 years of punishing himself because he hadn't protected Colette, all of it gathered into the 2 hands, clenched so tightly that Sloane could see the knuckles go white under the warehouse lights. And Rourke saw it too. He knew he was about to die. Sloane knew Knox could kill him. Warren knew. Tate knew. The entire warehouse held its breath, waiting for the blow everyone believed was coming. "I want to kill you," Knox said, his voice very quiet, very flat, very controlled. The voice of a man holding the last thread between the man and the monster, and that thread was so thin it trembled in the wind. "You know I can. No one in this room will stop me. No one outside this room will ask." Rourke didn't move. "But someone taught me," Knox said, and his eyes were no longer on Rourke, but beyond him, into the empty space behind him, where 20 years of pain hung suspended. That real strength isn't taking someone down. It's deciding not to strike when you have the right to strike. Knox turned away, stepped out of Rourke's reach, and that was the hardest blow Knox Valenti had ever thrown in his life, because it wasn't a punch, but the decision not to punch, and Sloane stood behind him watching him walk away with wet eyes because she knew how much that moment cost. Knew each step Knox took away from Rourke carried the weight of 20 years gathered together. Warren stepped forward, put a hand on Rourke's shoulder, and 2 of Tate's men escorted him to the corner of the warehouse. At the same time, the door on the other side of the warehouse opened, and Catherine Ainsworth walked in. She had been there the whole time, sitting in the car outside, listening through the radio Warren had left open, and she came in not because she needed to see Rourke, but because she needed to see Knox, needed to confirm that the man she was about to sign a $200 million deal with was a man who could not kill when he had the right to kill. Catherine received the file from Lydia's hand, nodded once, and Sloane understood that the nod was worth more than any signature, because it meant Catherine Ainsworth's 30-year network would make sure Rourke Cassidy lost everything, not by bullets but by something worse than bullets in the underworld, being erased from the system, with no allies, no assets, no shelter, no identity, alive but non-existent. After Rourke was escorted out, Warren led Knox and Sloane to a hidden reinforced vault deep behind the warehouse walls, a private space Rourke thought only he could access. In the corner sat a heavy, biometric safe. Warren pulled a black decryption drive from his pocket, a tool he had prepared weeks ago specifically to bypass Rourke's personal encryption. Within moments, the electronic lock clicked open. Inside were 2 things. The first was a pocket watch, old, its silver dulled by time, with a short chain. The back was engraved with one word, Colette, and underneath it was a smaller line Knox had to lift close to his eyes to read. "Always my light." Knox's father's watch, the gift he had given Colette on her last birthday. The item the family reported missing at the scene of the Newark shooting, and no one had found for 20 years, because Rourke had taken it, kept it, 20 years, in a safe, like a trophy. Knox held the watch in both hands, and his hands trembled. The second time Sloane had seen Knox Valenti tremble, the first being the night on the fighting floor after she took him down, and this trembling was different, the trembling of a man who had just touched something he thought he had lost forever, and its return didn't bring joy, but new pain, because it confirmed that Rourke had not only caused Colette's death, he had also taken a keepsake from that little girl, taken the last thing her family had left of her, and hidden it in a safe, as if it belonged to him. The second thing in the safe was a notebook, not a few loose pages. A complete notebook, brown leather cover, old, worn, blue ink handwriting on yellowed paper, more than 100 pages thick. James Mercer's original notebook. The full notebook, of which the few loose pages Sloane kept in the shoebox, were only the part her father had torn out and hidden separately before the original was taken by Rourke after he killed him. Sloane held the notebook, and everything she had built for 10 years, the wall, the calm, the promise not to cry anymore since her mother's funeral, all of it shook, because in her hands was her father's handwriting, more than 100 pages of handwriting she had thought were gone forever. 10 years of believing the few loose pages in the shoebox were all that remained, and now she was holding all of it, heavy in her hands, real in her hands, and her eyes were wet. She didn't cry, not yet, but her eyes were wet, and she didn't try to hide it. And Knox stood beside her with Colette's watch in his hand, his hands trembling, his eyes carrying something Sloane had never seen on his face before. Not anger, not pain, but the emptiness of a man who had just found something he hadn't known he had been searching for across 20 years. The two of them stood in the small office behind the Red Hook warehouse, each holding something the traitor had stolen. Knox holding the memory of his sister, Sloane holding her father's voice, and no one said anything, because no words were enough, and none were needed. Knox couldn't sleep that night. He sat in the living room of the penthouse, on the 42nd floor, the lights on, because he never turned off the lights when he slept, and tonight he wasn't even trying to sleep. Colette's watch lying on the table in front of him and James Mercer's notebook resting on his lap. He had taken the notebook from Sloane when they left Red Hook, not by asking, only by looking at her, and she understood, handing it to him with both hands, and the trust in that gesture weighed far more than the notebook itself, because this was the most precious thing she had in the world, and she was placing it in the hands of the man who, 3 weeks earlier, had kicked over her bucket of water. Knox opened the notebook and began reading from the first page. James Mercer's handwriting was neat, clear, leaning slightly to the right, the handwriting of a man who wrote often and wrote quickly, but was never careless. The early pages were close combat technical notes, the kind of notes Knox immediately recognized as far beyond any curriculum he had ever seen. Not because they were complicated, but because they were so simple they were dangerous, each technique broken down into its core principle and rewritten in language even a child could understand. And Knox realized this was how James had taught Sloane, writing for his daughter to read, writing so that if one day he was no longer there, she could still teach herself from the page. Between the technical notes were short passages. Knox didn't know whether to call a journal or letters, because they were written in the first person but directed toward someone, toward Sloane, toward a future James wasn't sure he would be there to see. Today you asked why you had to learn how to fight when you didn't want to hit anyone. I don't know how to answer that properly. I only know the world doesn't ask whether you want it to before it comes. Page 37. You understood force redirection today, 8 years old. It took me until I was 12. You're better than me, Sloane. I'm proud and afraid at the same time. Page 64. Knox read for 3 hours. And with every page he read, he understood more not only about Sloane but about the thing he had never had. A father who saw his child clearly enough to put her onto paper, loved her enough to prepare for the day he might not be there, feared for her enough to teach her how to survive. Knox didn't have that. His father died when he was 23, leaving him an empire and enemies, and not one handwritten page, not one line saying, "I'm afraid for you," or "I'm proud of you." The final page. Knox turned to it and stopped, because the handwriting on this page was different. Still neat, still leaning right, but shakier, darker, as if the writer had pressed the pen harder than usual because his hand wasn't completely steady. A dated note sat in the upper corner, 2 weeks before James Mercer died. I'm afraid every day. Not afraid of dying. Afraid she'll have to live in this world without me to guide her. But I turn my fear into something smaller than what I'm protecting. Sloane is what I'm protecting. If I don't come home, she'll understand. Not today. but one day. And on that day, I want her to know that everything her father did, every strike he taught her, every night he stayed awake to write this notebook, was for one reason only, so you would be strong enough when I'm no longer strong enough for both of us. Knox closed the notebook, sat still, and what moved through him then wasn't tears. Not yet, but the realization that her father had written the words he had needed to hear for 20 years. That fear didn't mean weakness. That protecting someone didn't mean having to destroy everything else. That real strength wasn't the fist, but the decision, every day, that there was something bigger than your fear. James Mercer had written that for his daughter. But tonight, in a penthouse on the 42nd floor of Manhattan, it reached the person who needed to read it most. Knox stood, took the notebook, rode the elevator down to the 40th floor. The hallway was silent. The corridor lights glowed pale yellow. Sloane's door was closed. Knox placed the notebook in front of her room, standing it upright against the door so she would see it as soon as she opened it. He knocked once. A single knock. Then he walked away, down the hallway, without looking back, because he knew that if he stood there when she opened the door, he wouldn't find any words to say, and the last page of that notebook said everything for him that he didn't know how to say. Sloane opened the door 10 seconds after the knock, looked down. Her father's worn brown leather notebook was leaning against the doorframe, as if it had been waiting for her. She picked it up, knowing at once that Knox had read it because one page had been slightly folded at the corner. The last page. And Knox wasn't the kind of man who folded books, but sometimes a person's hand did things the mind didn't command when what they were reading touched the right place. She opened the final page. Read the words her father had written 2 weeks before he died, and everything Sloane Mercer had held together for 10 years. The wall, the promise, the resilience she wore like armor every day because there was no one she dared take it off in front of. All of it collapsed at once. Not loudly, not dramatically, just both knees touching the floor. The notebook pressed to her chest, and the first sob since her mother's funeral 2 years ago. No, since her father's funeral 10 years ago, because at her mother's funeral she had cried for her mother, but today she cried for her father, for the 8-year-old girl on the Portland porch, learning how to fight with her father and smiling so wide it showed the gap where a baby tooth had just fallen out. For the 10 years she had carried pain she wasn't allowed to set down, because there had been no one standing beside her to help hold it. Sloane sat on the floor of her room, her back against the wall beside the door, and cried with tears she had thought she no longer had. On the other side of the door, Knox hadn't gone as far as he had meant to. He stopped in the middle of the hallway when he heard the crying through the wooden door. Small, choked, the kind of crying from someone who didn't want anyone to hear but couldn't control it anymore. He turned back, stood in front of her door, and didn't knock, didn't open it, didn't step inside, because he understood, through something Sloane had begun teaching him over the past 2 weeks, without needing to put it into words, that some pain needed space, needed to be cried without being watched, needed to be set down without someone picking it up too soon. Knox sat down on the hallway floor, his back against Sloane's door, Colette's watch pressing against his chest from inside his pocket, and for the first time in 20 years, Knox Valenti's tears fell. Not the crying of anger, not the crying of self-pity, the crying of a man who had finally allowed himself to hurt without needing to turn the pain into violence. 2 people sat on opposite sides of a closed door, one side holding her father's notebook, the other holding his sister's watch, crying for the people they had lost, and for the years they had carried that loss alone, and the door between them was both distance and connection, because both of them knew the other was on the other side, and both of them chose not to open it, and that choice was the most intimate thing these 2 scarred people had ever given each other. Catherine Ainsworth signed the $200 million deal the next morning in Knox's penthouse, with a silver fountain pen and not one unnecessary word, because Catherine was the kind of person who understood that the most important decisions didn't need speeches attached to them. She had seen enough over the past 48 hours, had seen the Valenti organization ambushed and watched how it responded, had seen Knox stand before the man who had killed his sister and not kill him, had seen a 26-year-old woman lead 2 men out of an ambushed warehouse with nothing but her bare hands, and all of those things together told her more than any balance sheet or strategic presentation Knox could have prepared. She signed, stood, shook Knox's hand once, and the deal was done. Rourke Cassidy wasn't killed. He was erased, in the way only a 30-year network like Catherine Ainsworth's could erase a man. Accounts frozen within 24 hours. Allies turning their backs within 48 hours. The Murray Hill apartment sealed, his name disappearing from every contact list in the East Coast underworld so quickly it was as if he had never existed at all. In this world, being killed was an ending, but being erased was a sentence to keep living with nothing. No money, no name, nowhere to be accepted, no one answering the phone, and Sloane had been right when she said it was far worse than death. At noon that day, Catherine asked to meet Sloane privately, not in the penthouse, but in a cafe on the corner of West 57th Street, where Catherine ordered a cup of Earl Grey tea and sat across from Sloane with pale gray eyes that had judged hundreds of people over 30 years and had rarely judged wrong. "Your father trained 2 of my men in Boston in 2013, Catherine said, with no introduction, no small talk, going straight to what she wanted to say in the way 30 years in a man's world had taught her that women had no time for preambles. "Those 2 men now manage the Northeast Division for me. Both are still alive. Both still use the techniques he taught them. 9 years now." Catherine took a sip of tea. "In this damned profession, when people ask what legacy is, the only answer worth anything is this: the people you keep alive." Sloane said nothing. She held the cup of coffee she didn't drink and looked at the 58-year-old woman sitting in front of her, the woman who had buried a husband and 3 enemies and was still sitting here drinking Earl Grey tea with her back straight and not a single strand of platinum hair out of place. And she saw 30 years ahead of herself, saw the price, and saw what that price could buy. And she didn't know whether she wanted to become Catherine Ainsworth, but she knew she respected her in a way she rarely respected anyone. Catherine stood, left the tea money on the table, and added one more sentence before she left. "He's changing because of you. Don't let him go back." Then she stepped out onto the Manhattan street and vanished into the crowd, as though she had never sat there at all. That afternoon, Sloane was in the basement training room putting things away when she heard familiar footsteps at the door. Tate Moran stood in the doorway, his right shoulder still lightly bandaged from the Red Hook night, and on his face there was none of the hostility Sloane had grown used to seeing over the past 2 weeks. There was no friendliness either, because Tate was not a friendly man, but what sat on his face now was acknowledgement, the kind of silent acknowledgement men in this world gave each other when words were not enough and not needed. "You got my men out of Red Hook," Tate said, with no preamble, no explanation, because both of them knew he was talking about the 2 men trapped inside the warehouse whom Sloane had let out through the side door in 4 minutes. "Or men," Sloane said. Tate looked at her, for a long time. Then he nodded, once, heavy, real. The kind of nod Sloane knew cost more than any apology because Tate Moran didn't apologize, but that nod meant he would never again stand in the middle of the training room and say she was turning Knox into something that would get him killed. Not because he had changed his mind, but because she had proven herself in blood, in the only language this world recognized. Tate walked away without saying anything else. Sloane watched him go and realized that this was the first time Tate had called the men on the team "my men" in front of her, and the fact that she had corrected it to "our men," and he had nodded, meant she was no longer standing outside looking in. Night. Penthouse. 42nd floor. Manhattan lay below like a map of light, most of which Knox owned but had never truly seen until recently, because before Sloane, he had looked down at the city and seen territory, and now he looked down and saw a place where he wanted to build something other than an empire. Knox stood at the window with his back to Sloane, Colette's watch pressing lightly against his chest from inside his suit pocket. Sloane sat on the sofa, her father's notebook on her lap, the leather bracelet on her wrist, and the distance between them was as wide as the room but thinner than ever before. "Stay," Knox said without turning around, and his voice wasn't a command, wasn't an offer, but the voice of someone saying something he wasn't sure he had the right to say and yet could no longer keep himself from saying, not as a trainer, not as an ally. "Stay. With me. Because I don't want to be the man I am when you're not here." Sloane looked at his back, looked at the shoulders she had corrected hundreds of times in the training room, the shoulders she knew down to how many centimeters wide they were and how many kilos they could carry, shoulders that were still carrying something heavier than all physical weight combined. She had lived 10 years trusting no one, 10 years building walls even higher than Knox's. And now the man who had kicked over her water bucket 3 weeks earlier was standing with his back to her at the window, asking her to stay, not with money, not with power, but with the one thing Knox Valenti had not given anyone since he was 16 years old, the truth that he needed someone, "If I stay," Sloane said, her voice calm but not flat, the first time her voice carried something warmer than control. "Then I have conditions. No fighting floor because of anger. No violence because you hate yourself. If you fight for the right reason. If you're hurting, you tell me instead of going to find someone to punch. And if you want to punish yourself at 3 o'clock in the morning, you knock on my door instead of knocking a stranger's face." Knox turned around, looked at her, and for the first time in this entire story, Knox Valenti smiled. Not the predator's smile from the fighting floor, not the cold smile from the conference room, not any smile anyone in his organization had ever seen. This smile was small, tilted slightly to the left, bringing out a crease at the corner of his right eye that Sloane had never known existed. The smile of the human being behind the boss. The 16-year-old boy before the gunfire in Newark had taken away his ability to smile, at the same time it took away his sister. "Deal," Knox said. 3 o'clock in the morning. The underground fighting floor in the basement of the Brooklyn warehouse, the place where everything began, was empty now. The lights were off. There weren't 200 people. No sound of betting, no blood on the floor, no ex-MMA fighter lying face down, no crowd holding its breath. There was only the red exit light in the corner of the ceiling casting a thin layer of glow over everything, turning the room into something between a dream and a memory. Knox and Sloane sat on the fighting floor, in the center of it, in the exact spot where, 3 weeks earlier, he had gone down on one knee in front of her after the longest 60 seconds of his life. The bucket of water was still in the corner. No one had moved it. Or perhaps someone had tried to move it, and Knox had told them to leave it there. Sloane didn't ask why, because she understood that some objects became markers, and the bucket of dirty water in the corner of the underground Brooklyn fighting floor was the marker of the place where both their lives turned in a direction neither of them had seen coming. "I owe you a bucket of water," Knox said, his voice light, almost carrying the trace of a laugh. And the simple fact that Knox Valenti's voice could carry laughter without it being mockery or cold amusement was proof of everything that had changed. "You owe me more than a bucket of water," Sloane said, and her voice was light too, light in a way she hadn't allowed herself to be in front of anyone since her mother died, because lightness meant lowering her guard, and lowering her guard meant trusting that the person beside her wouldn't hurt her. And it had taken Sloane 10 years to reach a place where she could make a soft joke with someone at 3 o'clock in the morning without keeping part of herself hidden behind a wall. Silence. Not heavy silence. The silence of two people who didn't need to fill the space with words, because each other's presence was already enough. The red exit light touched the scars on Knox's wrist, touched the old leather bracelet on Sloane's wrist, touched the bucket of water in the corner of the room. And beneath that red glow, all of those things looked as if they belonged together in a way they would not have belonged under any other light. Then Sloane tilted her head and rested it on Knox's shoulder. Gently, slowly, on purpose. This wasn't her falling because she was tired. Wasn't a reflex because she was sleepy. This was the first time since her mother died 2 years earlier that Sloane Mercer willingly touched someone not to teach, not to correct posture, not to lead anyone out of an ambushed warehouse, but simply because she wanted to. Simply because his shoulder was there. Simply because, for the first time in 10 years, someone was sitting beside her at 3 o'clock in the morning and she didn't need to keep her walls up. Knox didn't move, didn't turn his head, didn't put an arm around her, didn't pull her closer, didn't do any of the things a man's instinct might do when the woman he cared about rested her head on his shoulder. He held that moment with absolute stillness, the way a person holds something fragile and precious, because he understood that what Sloane had just given him wasn't a small gesture. It was 10 years of loneliness being lowered in a single breath, and if he moved too quickly, he would break it. Two scarred people sat in the middle of the empty fighting floor beneath the red exit light, shoulder touching shoulder, breathing in the same rhythm. And the bucket of water in the corner was the only witness to a moment none of the 200 people who had stood there 3 weeks earlier could ever have imagined. Knox Valenti had spent 20 years searching for someone who could take him down. He found her while she was mopping the floor, and she took him down in a way he never saw coming. Not with her fists, but by being the first person to see that he was bleeding in a place no one else could see. She didn't save him. She simply refused to look away. This story isn't only the story of a mafia boss and a janitor girl. It is the story of never judging a person by the way they appear on the outside, because the strongest person in the room may be the one no one bothers to look at. It is the story of how true strength doesn't live in the fist, but in the decision not to strike when you have the right to strike. It is the story of how healing doesn't come from violence or isolation, but from daring to be weak in front of the right person, daring to let someone see the worst part of you without trying to turn it into something else. And more than anything, it is a story reminding us that every person around us is carrying something heavy that we cannot see, and sometimes what they need isn't advice, isn't money, isn't rescue, but simply someone who refuses to look away. If this story touched something real inside you, please press the like button, share it with someone you think needs to hear it, and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next stories we bring you every day. We would truly love to know how you feel after hearing this story. Have you ever met someone everyone overlooked, only to realize they were actually the strongest person you knew? Have you ever carried something alone for too long because you didn't dare set it down? Have you ever been the person who refused to look away when someone needed to be seen? Leave a comment below and share your story with us. Share the feelings from deep within your heart, because each comment you leave is not just a line of text on a screen, but a real connection between people who are listening to one another. Thank you for staying here until the end of the story. We wish everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace in every single day. Remember that you deserve to be seen, you deserve to be heard, and you deserve to be loved in the right way. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.